When my daughter-in-law kicked me out of my own house, I didn't scream or argue. I just packed, quietly, cut off the cash flow, took back my car, and headed straight to a $32 million estate in Malibu she never even knew I owned. "Pack your bags and get out today," Vanessa yelled across the kitchen. My son Julian just sat at the table, staring down at his phone, completely silent. In that exact moment, I realized my time in that house was over. My name is Eleanor. I'm 66 years old, a widow. After my husband passed away, I invited Julian and his wife to move into my sprawling home just outside of Boston. The plan was for them to take over the upper floor so they could save up some money. But piece by piece, Vanessa took over the whole place. It started small. She threw away my plants in the hallway without asking. Then she actually changed the locks to the upstairs flat. Now she was standing in my kitchen delivering an ultimatum because I dared to say no to babysitting my own grandkids for the weekend. I had already planned a trip with my lifelong friends. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just took a deep breath, picked up my mug, and poured my cold coffee down the sink. The sound of the liquid hitting the drain was the only noise in the room. Vanessa was breathing heavily, practically begging for a massive, dramatic screaming match. Julian glanced up, visibly sweating, bracing himself for tears or guilt trips. But I gave them nothing. For months, they had treated me like an unpaid nanny and maid, a burden who was just in their way. Vanessa assumed I was entirely dependent on them because I spent my days gardening and drove an old sedan. There was so much she didn't know. She didn't know who actually paid off the mortgage on this house. And most importantly, she had no clue what my late husband had left me: a massive stock portfolio and a piece of real estate they couldn't even fathom in their wildest dreams. A sprawling estate in Malibu, California that brought in a fortune every month and was currently valued at $32 million. I walked down the hall to my bedroom without a word and shut the door. My heart was beating at a perfectly calm, steady pace. It was time for a change, and I wasn't going to wait until tomorrow. I opened my laptop. No tears, just cold, hard facts. Looking at my bank account immediately grounded me. The dividends had hit right on schedule. The Malibu property, which I'd bought years ago as an investment and kept strictly as an exclusive rental, had actually become vacant the previous week. The lease with a prominent tech billionaire had just run out. I had originally planned to relist it, but those plans were officially canceled. I booked a first-class flight to Los Angeles for the following evening. Next, I logged into the online portal for the joint household account I shared with Julian for bills. I had been transferring $2,000 into it every month. I changed that automatic transfer to $0. The next morning, the kitchen was dead silent. Vanessa and Julian had already left for work. Leaving her mark, Vanessa had left a note on the counter. "Grocery list for the weekend. Get the steaks from the high-end butcher, not the cheap supermarket stuff." I let out a cold laugh. I picked up the note, folded it neatly, and tossed it straight into the recycling bin. I packed 2 suitcases, just my clothes, my old photo albums, and my essential documents. The furniture and the expensive family heirlooms on the ground floor would stay here. For now. I called the local utility companies. The house was entirely in my name, and so were the accounts for electricity and gas. I switched the billing method from my private credit card to the now empty household checking account. It wasn't about revenge. It was about handing over the reality of their situation. As I walked out the front door, I set my house key on the entryway console. I pulled the heavy door shut behind me, hearing it click. The car Julian drove was legally mine, and I had the spare key in my purse. Sitting at the airport terminal, I called a private towing service I kept on retainer. I authorized them to hook the car up from the driveway and move it to a secured storage unit. Julian was going to have to walk home tonight. The cross-country flight to the West Coast was long, but I didn't feel a single ounce of exhaustion. For the first time in years, a massive weight had been lifted off my chest. The flight attendant handed me a glass of champagne. I remembered something my mother used to tell me. A woman doesn't show her strength by being loud, Eleanor. She shows it by her absence. As the plane cut through the clouds, I pictured Julian's evening playing out. He'd get off work, look for the car, and find a completely empty driveway. He'd walk into the kitchen, find no groceries, and have to explain to Vanessa why his ride had vanished. I knew they'd try to call. I pulled my phone from my bag, popped out the SIM card, and slid it into a small travel case. For the next few weeks, my old number was completely dead to the world. I had already set up a new, unlisted international line for my bank notifications and emergency contacts. When I landed at LAX, a private chauffeur was already waiting for me at baggage claim. The California air was warm, thick with the scent of salt water and pure autonomy. The drive up to Malibu took about an hour, the Pacific Coast Highway winding beautifully along the ocean until we hit the gates of Emerald Bay. The estate sat perched high on a cliffside, a stunning monolith of concrete and floor-to-ceiling glass, offering an endless view of the Pacific. It was a modern architectural masterpiece worth every penny of its $32 million valuation, protected by massive security gates and a state-of-the-art surveillance system. The driver carried my bags inside. I stood in the center of the vast living room, watching the waves crash below, and took a deep, clear breath. There was no stale coffee here, no bitter accusations, no hostile daughter-in-law. I uncorked a bottle of wine and melted into the absolute silence. The first night of my new life had officially begun. 3 weeks slipped by effortlessly. I completely reinvented my daily routine. Every morning began with a long walk on the beach, followed by buying fresh fruit at the local market and spending hours reading on the sun-drenched deck. The tension drained from my shoulders. The lines of stress on my face simply vanished. By the 3rd week, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to pop my old SIM card back in. I wanted to see what the fallout looked like back in Boston. The second the network connected, the phone went completely haywire, vibrating uncontrollably in my hand. There were 42 missed calls from Julian, 18 from Vanessa, and a mountain of text and voicemail notifications. I played the first voicemail from Julian. His voice was laced with pure panic. "Mom, where are you? The car is gone. The power company just sent a shut-off notice and the household account is completely frozen. Vanessa is losing her mind. Please call me back." The next message was from Vanessa, sent 2 days later. Her tone had shifted drastically. The screaming, aggressive bully was gone, replaced by a desperate woman trying to mask her panic as maternal concern. "Eleanor, look, I was just stressed out that day. It was a misunderstanding. We're incredibly worried about you. Julian isn't sleeping. Please come home so we can talk things through." I deleted the messages without a second thought. They had genuinely believed I was the weak link they could walk all over. Now they were discovering that without my money and my silent management, their entire lifestyle was a house of cards. They suddenly had to cover the bills, manage the chores, and figure out public transit on their own. That evening, an email arrived from Julian. He used my old address since the phone was a dead end. He wrote to tell me they were planning to sell the house to cover the sudden debts piling up. They still naively believed they owned half of it. I typed out a brief, chilly response. "The house belongs to me alone. I have already hired a real estate agent. It goes on the market next week. You have 4 weeks to pack up and move out." Dear Quiet Revenge community, many of you have asked how you can help support the channel. We believe in being transparent. iTools may assist with some technical aspects of production, but every story is carefully selected, edited, reviewed, and prepared by real people who care deeply about the quality and message behind each video. Our goal has always been simple: to share meaningful stories that remind us of the importance of dignity, courage, family, and perseverance. If you would like to help us continue this work, please consider contributing the cost of a small cup of coffee. Patreon, https://www.patreon.com/quiet-revenge-family-co-fi, https://co-fi.com/the story, family PayPal, https://www.paypal.com/PayPal me/Kan Huang Min. Thank you for your kindness, your comments, and your continued support. The reply hit my inbox within 5 minutes, and this time, Vanessa didn't bother hiding behind Julian. The polite facade evaporated instantly. "You can't just throw us out on the street. That is completely illegal. We live here. Julian has tenant rights." I sat in front of my laptop in Malibu and let out a soft smile. Vanessa clearly didn't understand property law. There was no lease agreement written or oral. They had been living there entirely on my good graces, rent-free. Because I was liquidating the asset, their permission to occupy the property was officially revoked. I had already finalized the details with my bank before I left, and the agent had the keys to the separate lockbox. The next afternoon, Julian sent a text with a photo. It was a shot of a massive sign planted squarely in the front yard in Boston for Sale Prime, luxury real estate. Julian added a caption, "Mom, why are you doing this to us? Vanessa won't stop crying. We can't find an apartment we can actually afford on short notice." I felt absolutely no pity. When Vanessa was screaming in my face, wishing I would disappear into thin air, Julian had stood there and chosen silence. In my book, silence is an endorsement. They had used my generosity to demean me. Now they were going to learn exactly what it takes to survive in the real world without a safety net. I blocked Vanessa's email and number permanently. Any communication with Julian was restricted to email, only strictly professional and brief. I offered one concession: I would sign a lease on a small, basic 2-bedroom apartment back in Massachusetts, but the lease would be solely in his name, excluding Vanessa entirely. I wanted to see if he was finally capable of making a real choice. The clock was ticking. Back in Boston, the leaves were falling and the autumn chill was setting in while I watched the sunset over the ocean in Southern California. The contrast was poetic. They were shivering in a house they couldn't afford to heat, while I was basking in the coastal warmth. It was a crisp Saturday morning when my security system flagged an alert at the front gate. I looked up at the high-definition monitor in the kitchen and saw 2 incredibly familiar faces standing outside. It was Julian and Vanessa. They looked utterly exhausted, pale, and completely wad out from a cross-country flight. They had somehow managed to track me down, likely by digging through some old financial statements left behind in my home office. They were wrapped in heavy, cheap winter coats that looked completely absurd against the bright, sunlit Malibu backdrop. Vanessa's jaw was practically on the floor as she stared up at the concrete and glass fortress. She had clearly expected a modest retirement condo, not a multi-million-dollar architectural stronghold. I pressed the intercom button, my voice coming through cool and collected. "Can I help you?" "Mom, please just let us in," Julian cried out to the camera. "We spent the last of our savings on these plane tickets. We just need to talk to you." Vanessa pushed herself right up to the lens. "Eleanor, please, we are so sorry. I was under so much pressure at work. We can fix this as a family. Look at this place. There's more than enough room for all of us to live here." And there it was, the blatant, unadulterated greed in her eyes. Even in total defeat, she was already calculating the square footage and looking for a way to angle her way in. She genuinely believed she could move into my sanctuary. She still had no concept of who she was dealing with. "Julian can come up to the house. Alone," I announced through the speaker. "Vanessa stays outside the gate." A furious argument erupted right on my security screen. Vanessa was shoving Julian, screaming at him not to dare leave her out there. But Julian, physically drained and utterly broken, pushed the heavy gate open the moment I buzzed the lock. He walked through, leaving his wife hyperventilating on the sidewalk. For the first time in his marriage, he drew a line. Julian stood in my living room, looking incredibly small. He barely even dared to sit down on the pristine white leather sofa, looking down at his scuffed shoes. He stared out at the vast expanse of the Pacific, then turned his eyes to me. I handed him a glass of ice water. No coffee, no welcoming hug. "It's incredible here, Mom." He muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this place?" "Because this is my life, Julian, not yours," I replied, keeping my posture straight and steady. "You stood by and allowed your wife to evict me from my own home. You didn't say a single word while she degraded me." "I was terrified of losing her," he said, dropping his chin to his chest. "And in the process, you lost me," I said cleanly. "I built my life with your father's legacy and my own hard work. I don't owe either of you a thing. You both assumed I was just a frail old woman you could exploit for free labor and housing." He broke down, tears streaming down his face. It had been years since I'd seen my son cry. A part of me twinged with a mother's instinct, but I kept my face entirely unreadable. Showing weakness now would ruin everything. He needed to feel the weight of his choices if he was ever going to grow up. Outside the security gate, Vanessa was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. She was aggressively stabbing at her phone screen, undoubtedly text-bombing his phone. Julian looked down as his screen lit up, paused, and then flipped the phone face down on the coffee table. A small, necessary step forward. "The closing paperwork on the Boston house is almost finalized," I informed him, keeping the tone strictly business. "The entire profit from the sale goes directly to my personal accounts. I'm not giving you a handout. However, I did find a small apartment on the outskirts of Boston. I've paid the rent a full year in advance. Vanessa's name is nowhere near the paperwork. If you move in solo. If she steps foot inside, the lease is terminated and you're both out." Julian just stared at me. The ball was entirely in his court, and he had to make the most defining choice of his adult life. Julian walked back down the long drive to deliver the reality of the situation to Vanessa. I watched the entire interaction play out in high definition from the monitors on my terrace. The moment the words left Julian's mouth, Vanessa absolutely lost it. She began wildly flailing her arms, slapping her hands against his chest, and screaming so loudly that her screeching echoed all the way up the cliffside. She was demanding that he storm the house, that he demand his inheritance, calling me a manipulative old viper. Julian just stood there. He didn't hit back, but he didn't back down either. He looked like a man who had suddenly been hit with a bucket of ice water after a decade-long sleep. He was looking at his wife with complete clarity, seeing the sheer ugliness of her entitlement, an ugliness he had spent years making excuses for. Without saying another word, Julian turned his back on her and started walking down the winding hill toward the coastal highway. He just left her standing there. Vanessa screamed his name at the top of her lungs, but when she realized he wasn't turning around, her legs gave out and she collapsed onto the pavement. She was sobbing out of pure rage, not heartbreak. She had lost everything in a single afternoon: the beautiful house in Boston, the financial backing, her sense of control, and the husband she had easily puppeted for years. She glared back up at my cliffside deck one last time. I stood firmly at the glass railing, looking down at her without an ounce of regret. I raised my wine glass toward the horizon and took a slow sip. It wasn't a feeling of malicious triumph. It was just the profound, clean feeling of relief. Vanessa eventually gathered her purse, pulled herself up, and began the long walk down the hill after Julian. They had no car, no hotel reservation, and almost no money left. They were going to have to find a bus stop. In that exact moment, the natural order of things was restored. A boundary had been drawn, built out of solid concrete and harsh reality. A week later, I flew back east. Not to stay, but to sign the final closing documents at the real estate office. The buyers were a lovely young couple with 2 toddlers. They were going to fill that house with genuine warmth and laughter, the kind of energy it deserved, not greed and resentment. Julian had already cleared out his things. He had accepted my terms. He was officially living in the small apartment outside the city. He had sent me a brief, sober email a few days prior. I moved in alone. Vanessa is staying on her mother's couch. I've contacted a divorce attorney. I didn't visit him at his new place. It was far too soon for a heartwarming reconciliation. He needed to walk this path entirely on his own 2 feet to find his backbone. But I did call him from the airport lounge once the sale was officially recorded. The funds have cleared into my account. I told him over the phone line. I've set up a structured trust fund for my grandkids. The money is legally locked down exclusively for their college education. Neither you nor Vanessa can touch a single dime of it. It transfers to them when they turn 18. Thank you, Mom. His voice cracked thick with emotion. And I'm so sorry for everything. I know you are Julian, I replied gently but firmly. Make sure you actually learn from this. Before my flight, I had taken one last walk through my old home while it was completely empty. There was no furniture left, no lingering ghosts of the past. When I locked the front door and handed the keys to the agent, I didn't feel a single pang of sadness. A house is just wood and stone. My real strength was something I carried inside myself. I walked straight to my gate. My ticket back to Los Angeles was already scanned. My life was out there now, where the sun warmed the coast and the endless horizon reminded me just how trivial human dramatics really are. Back home in Malibu, the evening air was perfectly still and the distant lights of the coast danced across the dark surface of the ocean. I sat out on my terrace, wrapped in a plush, warm blanket, sipping a hot cup of chamomile tea. My phone was beautifully, blissfully quiet. No frantic calls, no threatening emails, no lingering anxiety. The sale of the Boston property had injected an incredible amount of liquidity into my finances, not that I even needed it. But there was a deep satisfaction in knowing all my loose ends were tied up cleanly. Every couple of weeks, Julian would email me photos of the kids. He had them every other weekend now. In the pictures, he looked tired, but there was a newfound peace in his eyes. He was finally carrying the weight of his own life, and it was making him stronger. Vanessa's name never came up anymore. She had learned the hard way that some boundaries cannot be crossed without consequences. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had simply pruned it. I cut away the toxic elements to save the healthy core from rotting. Sometimes you have to be completely uncompromising just to keep from losing your own soul. I looked out over the vast, dark water. At 66, I still had so many chapters left to write. And every single one of those years would be lived entirely on my own terms. No one was ever going to tell me what to do in my own space again. I was the absolute master of my own destiny, insulated by a fortress of glass financial wisdom and unshakable boundaries. Life was finally back in perfect equilibrium. I closed my eyes, letting the rhythmic, powerful roar of the Pacific waves wash over me. I was finally exactly where I belonged.